a young, sensitive, and intuitive artist who sees in her new home an opportunity to inspire her works. She is an introspective person, often guided by her emotions. A mystery writer, pragmatic and rational, but with a creative mind. He is excited about the idea of living in a place that can feed his imagination and help in the production of his next book. The couple decides to leave the hectic life of the city behind in search of tranquility and a favorable environment for their creative work. They find the house through an enigmatic ad that describes the place as full of history and character, which attracts them instantly. The house is a Victorian mansion situated on top of a hill, surrounded by old trees that seem to whisper with the wind. The windows are high and narrow, with heavy velvet curtains that obscure the interior. The paint is faded and peeled, and the vegetation grows wild, giving the house an abandoned appearance. Upon entering, Anne and Jack are greeted by a long corridor with creaking wooden floor. The rooms are spacious but poorly lit, with old furniture and covered by a thin layer of dust. Old paintings adorn the walls, depicting dark faces that seem to follow the couple's movements. The atmosphere of the house is oppressive, with an air of antiquity that weighs on the shoulders of those who enter. There is a slight musty smell mixed with something sweet and unpleasant, like wilted flowers. Despite the initial discomfort, the house has a decadent beauty that fascinates the couple. Anne and Jack settle in their new rooms and feels a slight restlessness, but attributes it to the tiredness of the change. During the night, she wakes up with a distant sound, almost imperceptible, but cannot identify the source. She is convinced that it's just the house settling in. The next day, the couple starts to explore the house. They find several peculiarities, such as an ancient pendulum clock that stopped at a precise time, 3:15 a.m., and a series of doors that seem to lead nowhere. There is a constant feeling that there is more in the house than you see. Small details begin to bother and shadows that seem to move on the walls, a mirror in the hallway reflecting distorted images, and a sudden cold that appears without explanation. Jack, on the other hand, is absorbed in the dark beauty of the house, seeing it as the perfect setting for his new book, and is awakened by an uncomfortable feeling, a mixture of cold and anxiety. She hears a very low sound, like a whisper, coming from somewhere in the hall. The sound is indistinct, with words that she cannot understand, but cause a deep restlessness. She tries to identify the source of the sound, but all she finds is the darkness in the corridor. Convinced that she is just imagining things, and goes back to bed, but the sound remains in her mind, preventing her from sleeping again. Jack continues to sleep soundly, oblivious to Anne's discomfort. She decides not to wake him, believing he would think she was exaggerating or being paranoid, and is convinced that it was just the wind or the old house making natural noises. In the following days, whispers begin to occur more often and in different parts of the house. And hears the sounds during the day while working in her studio and at night while walking around the house. They are brief, but unmistakable, voices that seem to be arguing, whispering secrets, or even calling out her name. The voices are not constant, which increases Anne's anxiety, who never knows when she will hear them again. The tone of the voices varies, sometimes sad, sometimes angry or pleading. This makes her feel that the house is alive and trying to communicate with it, and begins to hear the whispers even when she is outside the house, especially at dusk. It is as if the voices follow her, becoming a constant presence in your life. She begins to lose her appetite and has nightmares where voices whisper directly into her ear. During an attempt to relax in the bathtub, Anne hears the whispers so clearly and closely that she jumps out of the water in a panic, feeling as if someone was there with her, whispering at her neck. She begins to avoid the rooms of the house where whispers are more frequent, but soon discovers that there is no escape, and begins to spend more time outside the house, but still the whispers continue. She feels persecuted by something that she cannot see, but which seems to be constantly at her side. Your mental health begins to deteriorate, with insomnia, anxiety, and a growing sense of despair. Jack begins to genuinely worry about Anne's well-being, seeing how the situation is affecting her. He decides they need to find out what's going on before and completely loses control. And, seeking distraction and answers, decides to explore more thoroughly the rooms and corners of the house that they had not yet fully investigated. She is attracted to a specific room in the attic, which seems to be locked for a long time. When she manages to open the door with an old key found in the kitchen and discovers a dusty room with furniture covered by white sheets, there is a heavy feeling in the air, as if time had stopped there. On top of an old dresser, she finds a delicately carved wooden box containing a collection of antique objects, a gold brooch, a black and white photograph of an unknown family, and a porcelain doll with strangely vivid eyes. Inside a chest, and finds a series of handwritten letters and diaries, some dating back several decades. The letters seem to be from different residents who passed by the house, each expressing a growing sense of restlessness and fear. Some mention the same whispers that Anne has heard, while others speak of terrifying visions. The diaries detail the last days of some residents, with increasingly confused and desperate writings, mentioning the feeling of being watched and the growing paranoia that something in the house was trying to dominate them. The most disturbing is that all the diaries end abruptly, without an explanation of what happened to their authors, and also finds a box full of old photographs, which show different families posing in front of the house at various times. In some, she notices strange details, like dark shadows that don't make sense or blurry faces, as if the people in the photos are trying to disappear. A particular photo deeply upsets her, an image of a smiling couple who look incredibly like her and Jack, but wearing clothes from another era. After the discovery of the strange objects, and shares with Jack what she found, he, who was skeptical until then, begins to realize that something really strange is happening. That night, while sleeping, Jack is awakened by a voice whispering directly into his ear, clear and distinct, calling him by name. He stands up abruptly, frightened, and realizes that the voices are everywhere, echoing through the halls and appearing to come from all directions. The voices seem to know intimate details about him, whispering memories and secrets he never told anyone. This deeply shakes his skepticism, and he begins to understand the terror that Anne has faced. Jack, now terrified and in disgust what to do, he finally admits that something supernatural is happening, but refuses to believe they are trapped. Jack tries to rationalize the situation, suggesting that there may be a scientific or psychological explanation for what is happening, like a gas leaking in the house that is causing hallucinations. Anne, however, is convinced that the house is cursed and that the objects she found have some connection to the spirits trapped there. The tension between the two increases as Jack struggles to keep his sanity and sinks deeper into her fear. After the discussion, the feeling of being watched intensifies for both. Even when they are together, they feel a presence in the rooms, as if the spirits were watching each movement, waiting for something. The home environment becomes increasingly oppressive, and the temperature seems to drop dramatically, especially in certain rooms, and begins to notice that the objects she has found change places on their own, and sometimes disappear completely, only to reappear in unexpected places. Jack begins to have visions of unknown people in the mirrors or windows, figures that disappear as soon as he tries to focus on them. The house, which before seemed only old and worn out, now seems to gain life of its own. The doors close and lock themselves, lights flash, and there are constant footsteps and scratches on the walls. The sound of the clock standing in the corridor begins to echo through the house, as if it was working again, but always at the same time. 3:15 a.m. The couple begins to lose track of time, with days that seem to drag on endlessly, and nights that are plagued by nightmares and visions. The psychological pressure on them increases, while the house seems to be playing with their minds, trying to break down their resistance. Jack revisits the diaries and letters that Anne found, looking for any clues that might explain what is going on. He begins to perceive a pattern. All previous residents have reported experiences similar to his, with whispers, visions, and the feeling of being observed. The scariest thing is that in the latest reports they all mention one name, a name that Jack now hears repeatedly in the whispering voices of the house. The diaries mention attempts to escape, all unsuccessful, and some suggest that the house is somehow alive, feeding on the fear and sanity of its residents. Jack begins to feel that the house is testing them, trying to break their will before locking them there forever. The tension between Anne and Jack reaches a critical point. They start arguing frequently, with Jack getting angrier and more desperate. Both realize that the house is trying to separate them, isolate them, and weaken them. They begin to realize that each strange object found in the house has a history connected to someone who lived there before. It is as if each item was charged with negative energy, feeding the spirits that haunt them. After the increasing intensity of the demonstrations in the house, Jack decides it's time to find out what is really going on. He visits the local library and talks to the oldest residents of the city, trying to find any record or history about the house. The name House of Voices comes up repeatedly, associated with stories of disappearances and tragedies. He finds old records of the house that reveal a dark history. The house was built by a man named Nathaniel Crowley in the late 19th century who was known for occult practices. Jack discovers that Crowley performed macabre rituals inside the house, which he believed were necessary to achieve spiritual immortality. Upon further investigation, Jack discovers that the first residents after Crowley, a young family, have mysteriously disappeared, and the house has been empty for years before being sold again. Since then, there have been reports of strange occurrences in the house, and all subsequent residents faced a tragic fate. Each family or individual who lived in the house reported hearing voices and feeling an evil presence. None of them managed to live there for long, and all disappeared or died in unexplained circumstances. The dates of disappearances coincide with specific astrological events, suggesting that the house is connected to something beyond the physical world. Desperate to understand what is happening and get rid of the constant terror, and decides to try to communicate directly with the voices. She begins to feel that the spirits are trying to talk to her, but something or someone prevents them from manifesting completely. One night, and prepares a spiritual session using candles and some of the old objects she found in the house. During the session, voices become clearer and begin to manifest as shadows and indistinct shapes. The voices, although fragmented, ask for help and speak of a force that keeps them there. The voices reveal that they are spirits of former residents of the house, all of them attracted and imprisoned by Nathaniel Crowley. They explain that Crowley performed a ritual that cursed the house, turning it into a prison for the souls of those who lived in it. The spirits are trapped in an endless cycle of torment, unable to move forward, and begins to understand that the house is not only haunted, but that it is a kind of trap for souls. She also realizes that the same thing is happening to her and Jack. The house is trying to trap their souls forever, just as it did with the former residents. The spirits explain that Crowley's curse was designed to keep them trapped in the house as a source of power for him even after his death. Crowley believed that by absorbing the vital and spiritual energy of the inhabitants, he could transcend death and live forever, even as only a ghostly presence in the house. The curse was reinforced by a ritual involving the elements and stars, linking the house to a supernatural force. Anyone who entered the house would be condemned to remain there, trapped by the will of Crowley, who still exists as a dominant entity, unable to release the souls he captured. And in Jack, now aware of the gravity of the situation, try to find a way to break the curse. The voices of the spirits reveal that the only way to break the curse would be to undo Crowley's ritual, but this requires a sacrifice. One of the current residents must offer his soul in exchange for the freedom of others. Jack, initially resistant, begins to consider the idea, especially as the demonstrations in the house become more violent and dangerous. They know that they need to act fast, because the house seems to be closing on them, trying to break their resistance and their sanity. The supernatural manifestations in the house increase in intensity. Voices become cries, objects begin to fly around the house, and the very structure of the house seems to deform, with walls that approach, corridors that stretch and doors that disappear. Jack begins to have disturbing visions of Nathaniel Crowley, who provokes him and tries to seduce him with promises of power and forbidden knowledge. And, on the other hand, is tormented by the spirits who now seem desperate, their voices begging her to free them before it's too late. The couple tries to leave the house several times, but all attempts fail. The doors that once led out now lead to strange places, like rooms that should not exist, or to the same place they came from. They realize that the house is bending reality around them, turning into an inescapable maze. Psychological isolation also increases, and Jack begin to lose track of time, with days and nights merging and moments of complete darkness where they can't even see their own hands. The feeling of despair intensifies, and they know that the house is close to consuming them completely. And in Jack face a terrible dilemma. One of them must sacrifice himself to break the curse and free trapped souls, including his own. The choice weighs on them, and both struggle with fear of death and the desire to save the other. They discuss what to do. Jack, now recognizing the gravity of the situation, begins to accept that perhaps he needs to be the sacrifice. He realizes that it has a better chance of surviving and living a life after this, while he, already shaken psychologically, feels that he can no longer escape the influence of Crowley. Finally, Jack decides to volunteer, believing that by doing so he can protect and give her a chance to live. And, devastated, tries to convince him to find another solution, but the house does not give them a choice. They make a pact. Jack will perform the ritual sacrifice, but Anne promises that if she survives, she will tell the story and warn others about the curse of the house. After the terrible choice to sacrifice one of them, Jack decides that he will be the sacrifice, and, still devastated by the decision, tries to find a way to save Jack and break the curse without losing her husband. However, the voices of the spirits and the house itself make it clear that there is no other way out. Jack and Anne, in a quiet moment before the storm, share a last meal together. The mood is heavy, and the couple, aware of what is to come, tries to comfort each other. They revisit happy memories, trying to keep sanity in front of what awaits them. And Jack prepare the place where the ritual will be held. The attic, where Crowley performed the original ritual. The environment is oppressive, with dense air and loaded with negative energy. The attic is filled with ancient symbols and marks on the floor that seem to pulse with a supernatural energy. They arrange the objects found in the house, the gold brooch, the porcelain doll, and other items, around a circle of black candles. These items, linked to the trapped souls, are placed as offerings. The candles, once lit, cast shadows that seem to move on their own, projecting distorted shapes on the walls. When everything is set, Anne and Jack begin to notice a change in the environment. The voices of spirits, who before begged for help, begin to turn into cries of anguish and fury. The spirits perceive the imminent sacrifice and, fearing that their existence is erased, begin to manifest themselves physically. The shadows materialize in spectral figures, some with distorted faces of pain and despair, others without defined traces, like blurring of darkness. These spirits try to stop the ritual, believing that it will lead to its ultimate destruction. The attic, now an epicenter of supernatural activity, is filled with a cacophony of shouts, whispers, and laments. During the final preparation, Jack is suddenly attacked by these entities. The shadows cast themselves on him, trying to drag him into the darkness that forms in the center of the attic, and, desperate, tries to drive them away, but her presence is almost insignificant in the face of the strength of the enraged spirits. Jack struggles to stay in control, his sanity starting to fragment under the overwhelming pressure of supernatural forces. He begins to hear Crowley's voice in his mind, trying to convince him to give up and surrender to the darkness, promising relief from torment in exchange for acceptance. At the climax of the confrontation, the figure of Nathaniel Crowley is fully manifested in the attic. He appears as a tall, thin man with a macabre countenance and eyes that shine with an evil power. Crowley, now a consummate evil entity, reveals that he controls the spirits and the house itself. Crowley goes directly to Jack and Anne, mocking their attempts to break the curse. He explains that the house is a reflection of his power and that by sacrificing himself, Jack will only strengthen Crowley's connection to the world of the living. Crowley tries to manipulate Jack, offering him a false hope of salvation or even power if he agrees to join him. And, realizing that Crowley is trying to corrupt the mind of Jack, decides to confront him. She accuses Crowley of being the real responsible for the imprisonment of souls and the curse of the house. Using the knowledge acquired in the diaries and letters, and tries to weaken Crowley's power by reciting passages from the text that describe forms of banishment and rituals of protection. Crowley, initially disdainful, begins to show signs of weakness when Anne recites the ancient rituals. The house begins to shake, and the spirits seem to retreat momentarily, as if Crowley's influence is diminishing. Despite Anne's intervention, Jack realizes that the only way to free the souls and weaken Crowley definitively is to go ahead with the sacrifice. He prepares to perform the final act, knowing that it will seal his fate, but believing that at least and will be released. With the ceremonial dagger found among Crowley's belongings, Jack stands in the center of the circle of candles. He recites the words of the ritual, an ancient invocation that should have granted Crowley immortality but will now be used to seal his fall. At the critical moment, as Jack is about to complete the ritual, Crowley tries to intervene one last time, summoning all the spirits of the house to stop Jack. The scene turns into total chaos, with shadows trying to engulf Jack and Anne. Jack, in an act of supreme determination, ignores the torment and sacrifices himself, shedding his blood at the center of the circle. The reaction is immediate. The candles burst into blue flames, and an energy wave runs through the house, shaking its foundations. Crowley cries out in agony as his form begins to disintegrate, pulled into the void by the power of sacrifice. With the sacrifice of Jack, the curse that held the souls in the house is broken. The spirits, once tormented, begin to fade in a soft light, leaving the house alone for the first time in decades, and watches as the spectral figures dissipate, finally released from the prison that Crowley had created. Crowley, unable to resist the power of the sacrificial ritual, is dragged into the abyss, his cries of anger and despair echoing through the house. The evil presence that permeated the house disappears, and the heavy and oppressive environment is replaced by absolute silence. And, devastated by the loss of Jack, realizes that he is gone forever. The house, now free of the curse, seems empty and lifeless, as if his soul had gone along with the spirits, and feels a mixture of relief and deep sadness, knowing that Jack sacrificed himself so she could live. The house, now an empty shell, begins to show signs of disintegration. The walls, once so solid, begin to crack, and the structure seems ready to collapse. And understands that the house, without the spirits and without Crowley, has no reason to exist. With the house falling apart around her, and runs out before everything falls down. The entrance door, which before seemed impassable, now opens easily, and escapes from the house at the last moment, looking back only to see the structure crumble into a cloud of dust and rubble. She falls to her knees in the garden, exhausted and emotionally destroyed, but finally free. The sky, once dark and oppressive, begins to clear, as if nature itself was relieved by the end of the curse. In the following days, Anne tries to rebuild her life, but is deeply marked by the events she lived. She carries the pain of losing Jack, but also the weight of the promise she made to him, telling the story and warning others about the dangers of cursed places like House of Voices, and decides to write about her experience, turning the story into a book that combines the account of what happened with an investigation of Nathaniel Crowley and his occult practices. The book, though frightening, serves as a warning, and in hopes that the story of Jack and the trapped spirits will help to avoid future tragedies. After escaping from the house and witnessing its destruction, and is haunted by Jack's sacrifice and the horrors she has faced, she feels a mixture of relief and guilt, wondering if she could have done anything to prevent her husband's death. Constant nightmares over the attic, Crowley, and tormented souls haunt her, making it difficult for her to sleep and adjust to normal life. Even away from home, and can't escape the feeling that something is still wrong. Small events, like shadows in the corner of her eye, whispers on darker nights, make her question whether she really managed to get rid of everything that the house stood for, and remembers the promise she made to Jack, telling the world what happened and warning others of the dangers of cursed places like House of Voices. Determined to honor this promise, she begins writing a book detailing every moment she lived in the house, from moving in to Jack's sacrifice. The writing process is therapeutic for Anne, but it also forces her to relive the most traumatic moments of her life. She delves into her research on Nathaniel Crowley and other cases of haunted houses, finding that the House of Voices is just one of several around the world with similar stories of rituals, curses, and sacrifices. When the book is finally published, it becomes an instant hit. People are fascinated and terrified by Anne's story, and the book gains notoriety among both horror story enthusiasts and in academic circles of occultism and parapsychology. Many see the account as a warning, while others begin to question the veracity of the story. The attention that the book attracts puts Anne in the spotlight. She is invited to interviews, TV shows, and conferences where she is repeatedly asked about her experience. Despite success, Anne continues to struggle with the trauma and loss of Jack, and often during these public appearances it is visible that she still carries a great emotional weight. The book also generates controversy. While many believe in story, there are those who accuse her of fabricating it to gain fame and fortune. Some skeptics suggest that Anne was mentally unstable, or that the events were the result of hallucinations caused by stress and trauma from her personal life. On the other hand, occult experts begin to investigate more deeply the story of Nathaniel Crowley, finding evidence that corroborates some of what Anne wrote. Some even try to explore the ruins of the house, which are now seen as a place of intense spiritual power, albeit dangerously unstable. Anne's book leads to an increased interest in haunted house stories and curses. Documentaries, films, and other works of fiction begin to appear, inspired by Anne's experience. The House of Voices becomes a popular term for describing any place that seems to harbor restless spirits or be marked by supernatural events. Anne, however, is not proud of this legacy. She sees the growing commercialization of her story with a mixture of sadness and frustration, fearing that people are ignoring the real danger that places like the house represent. For her, the story was never about fame, but about a serious warning that she fears being lost in the midst of entertainment and profit. Occult researchers, both amateur and professional, continue to investigate the story of Nathaniel Crowley and the house, some seeking to understand the source of his power, others hoping to find ways to prevent something similar from happening again. These researchers begin to draw connections between the House of Voices and other hidden power sites, suggesting that there is a network of places around the world with similar stories. Some even theorize that the house was a portal or a point of convergence of spiritual energy, and that the destruction of the house did not necessarily close the danger. These theories, although controversial, keep the interest alive and contribute to the aura of mystery and terror that continues to surround history. Despite the destruction of the house, Anne begins to notice signs that Crowley's evil has not been completely extinguished. She receives anonymous letters, emails, and messages from people claiming to have experiences similar to hers. Some report voices in their own homes, disturbing visions or encounters with shadowy entities, and becomes increasingly concerned that Crowley, or something connected to him, is still active in some way. This idea torments her, and she begins to question whether the destruction of the house was really the end, or just a new beginning for something more sinister. In a particularly vivid nightmare, Anne dreams of Crowley. In the dream, he appears more powerful than ever, saying that Jack's sacrifice has only strengthened him and that he is now free to extend his influence beyond the house. Crowley promises to continue his quest for souls and power, no longer limited by a specific location, and wakes up with the feeling that the danger has not passed. She feels that Crowley somehow survived the destruction of the house and that his influence may be spreading. This thought fills Anne with a new kind of fear, a fear that despite all her suffering, she has only delayed the inevitable, and feels an irresistible force that forces her to return to the place where the house existed. Now only a ruin, with rubble and debris covered by vegetation, the place still exudes a dark aura, and wonders if the decision to return is safe, but feels she needs to end this part of her life. In what remains of the attic, Anne finds a small object that survived the destruction, the gold brooch she found at the beginning, one of the first signs of the presence of the spirits. Touching him, she feels a wave of cold energy and hears for a brief moment the voice of Jack, whispering to leave before it is too late. Suddenly, Anne is enveloped by a growing darkness. Crowley's presence manifests itself in a powerful way, as a colossal shadow that threatens to swallow it, and realizes that Crowley used Jack's sacrifice to anchor himself more firmly in the world of the living, and now wishes to take Anne's soul as his next victim. And, in a final act of despair, uses the brooch as a focus to channel the energies that remain from the ritual. She recites the words she has memorized from Crowley's diary, trying to banish him once and for all. The fight is intense, with the shadow of Crowley struggling and trying to suffocate her, but Anne persists, concentrating all her strength in the ritual. At the climax of the confrontation, Crowley's shadow appears to be destroyed by an intense glow emanating from the brooch, which finally explodes in a blinding light, and falls, exhausted, feeling as if all the weight of the world has been taken off her shoulders. When she regains consciousness, she realizes that the evil presence has disappeared and everything around her is silent, and believes she finally managed to defeat Crowley, but there is a sense of uncertainty. She looks up at the sky, now clear, but wonders if Crowley was really destroyed or just temporarily banished. This doubt consumes her, leaving her with a feeling of triumph mixed with a persistent fear, and, still shaken, leaves the place destroyed for the last time. She feels that she can no longer stay in the city and decides to move into a new life, away from any memory of the house. Even so, the trauma accompanies her, and the feeling that Crowley can somehow come back never completely abandons her. She lives in constant tension, waiting for the day when something strange or supernatural happens again. Despite trying to lead a normal life,